Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Chris from Paint and Glory here, and we're back painting 15mm Vikings for the Little Wars TV Army Painting Challenge, and boy, have we got a lot of paints going on here. So last time we checked in, we were looking at some 15mm berserkers, and we were really focusing on painting skin tone. Now we're going to start with the barbarian flesh skin tone here because getting into the areas of the face underneath the helmet and behind the arms and the beards is difficult if you don't start out with that. And so I have a little bit of barbarian flesh on these, but these guys have a lot of clothes on, and thus it's not a lot of flesh to really get to, unlike the berserker figures. We're really just going to be trying to get in there, really at the eye area, sometimes depending on whether they have facial hair or not. This guy, I'm going to put a little dab here in his mouth. I might end up even totally covering that with facial hair. Whatever beard color I end up going for later on. Of course, the hands you can do now, although sometimes I come back and I do the hands later after I've done the sleeves. You really got to like angle that in there. And this is why I do this first, because I just got skin tone everywhere. I get in there, it doesn't really matter. But once I'm done with the skin tone on these figures, what I like to do when I paint figures on a popsicle stick like this, 15mm figures rather than putting them all on one thing, I've got 4 figures on this, or sometimes 3, is one way that you can get a lot of color variety when you're painting on popsicle sticks is depending on how many popsicle sticks you're doing. And in this case, we're doing dark ages. So you can see I have a lot of muted colors back here to represent my dark ages cloth colors. An off-white, kind of a beige, darker beige, a bit of a yellow, a couple of browns, a couple of grays, a bit of a desaturated blue, and a bit of a desaturated green. So I've got all my options here. I like to, each popsicle stick, depending on how many you have, I've got 11 different colors here. If I have 11 different popsicle sticks, I pick one popsicle stick and it becomes my off-white. My next one becomes my beige. My next one becomes my darker beige. My next one is my yellow. My next one's my light brown, my red brown, so on and so forth. So every popsicle stick, one item of clothing is going to be identical between everything on that popsicle stick. So you don't have to worry about, okay, this guy's going to be one color, this guy's being one color, this guy's being one color. They're all one color. Now, on these particular figures, because their shirts are covered mostly by their male shirt, I'm going to be going with the most amount of cloth on these figures, which is their pants. For these particular guys, I'm going to go with this desaturated green color. Greens, because, you can make a lot of dyes using basic green plants, a desaturated green color was not that uncommon, although it was less common than, say, these off-whites or these light browns or even grays. This green was not that uncommon a color in the Dark Ages, especially because these figures represent men of some kind of means. They have armor, they have shields, although the shields are not attached right now except for that one guy. They have helmets, they have sword. This guy has a sword. A sword is kind of like the it's like the Mercedes of weapons for a Dark Ages Viking. Most of them will fight with spears or with axes, but these are the wealthier men, so they're going to get a bit of wealthier colors, especially when we go and do their shirts. And then for 3 of these, their capes are going to get some crazier colors. Not too crazy, right? Not like neon pink, but they're not all going to be getting kind of like off-white cloaks or anything like that. So I've got some green lined up here. I've added a little bit of water. I've added a little bit of matte medium, not required in the slightest. It's just my preference. And I'm going to paint all of these, but I'm going to focus while I'm filming just on this guy here in the middle with the kind of the axe in his 2 hands and the shield in his back. I think he's got a good look that I can kind of in this. Now it looks quite green now. It's wet and it's shiny, but when it dries, and once I put a wash on it, it's going to kind of take a little bit of that green out of it, and it's going to end up looking a little more of a muted color, which I like for my Dark Ages figures. And this is also a period, it'll be easier to see when it dries, but if you look at the pants, I'm taking advantage of the fact that I have a white undercoat, because you can see kind of where his leg is bending right there, here at the knee, right underneath the mail. You can see there's a little raised area, I'm trying to get the camera to focus, there we go, where the white is kind of showing through because it is raised up, and that gives us a natural highlight. So we don't have to go in later and do quite as much highlighting. Or if you want to do highlighting, which I will, it's going to give you a roadmap for where you can highlight based on the raised areas of the cloth. So I'm going to hit these other guys with their skin tone and with their green pants, and then we're going to come back, and again, we're going to work our way from the inside out. We'll start working on the male hauberks, or shirts, or whatever they're called. So we're done painting the pants and also the skin. You'll also notice that I did paint this particular figure on the right. He has, it's a little hard to see right now, these kind of like quilted cloth or leather like boot toppers. I've seen these in some Osprey pictures. They're usually in kind of a reddish leathery brown, so I did them in fur brown. But the rest of these figures, now to give them some variety, so they're not all green and one color, each of their shirts, which there's not that much of, it's really just the sleeve, and then for some of them, underneath the male shirt, or I can go underneath them there. I'm going to hit them with 4 different colors. Now, this is where if you were batch painting, this would really work. If I had a bunch of different stands for this, I would hit maybe, one in every 6 or 7 figures would get this color, 1 in every 6 or 7 figures would get this color, and this color, and this color, and I'd have a couple other colors. But because I'm just painting this one stand for the video, it's going to be a little inefficient because I'm using 4 different colors. This is also an area where I'm going to point out that you could do a slightly different order in these. Notice that these figures, they have these cloaks, capes really, and there's a section of the cape that you have to paint in between their legs, and that could be a pain in the butt because then you're going to possibly get paint on the legs. If you wanted to paint the cloak first, the inner part of the cloak especially, as long as you knew what color you wanted their cape to be, you could do that. Now, I'm going to come back and do that later, and I'll do a little cleanup, but that is an area where instead of doing the pants first, you could do the back of the cloak first. But for now, I'm just going to do the sleeves. So for this, got these 4 different colors, and for my two-handed axe-wielding guy here, he's got a little here that you can see of his, I'll call it an undershirt, and that's split in the male. And then I also like to go underneath the mini, a very difficult camera angle, and just kind of like hit the underside of the mini. You don't have to use this color if you want. You could just kind of use like a very dark gray to represent shadow. I will admit, it is hard depending on the mini to get in there and get under it, but you don't want to leave that primer white, or if your primer didn't reach underneath there, you don't want to leave it silver. At the very least, go down there, maybe at the very beginning, and just hit it with like a dark gray. For me, I wouldn't use a pure black. I would use something like Necromancer Cloak, or another alternative from Vallejo would be, no, that's a wrong color, would be something like a German gray. Just again, it's just like a very dark gray, almost black. You could hit that in the underside, but I'm going to hit it with the cloth color. And then hit the sleeves with the gray color. And this is that part where I already did the skin, so I have to be careful when I get near the hands. I don't have to be careful when I hit the male, because I haven't painted the male yet. Although some metallic colors don't cover great. And we'll talk about metallic colors next, because that is our next step. So I don't have to worry about being messy. The further along you get in this process, the more you have to worry about being messy. If you're wondering why some of these figures, they have these weird black and white and gray speckles on them, it's because I got these figures secondhand, and there was paint on some of them, so I stripped them. Sometimes the paint does not 100% disappear in the crevices. I probably could have taken them for a second soak in my stripping fluid. I use LA's Totally Awesome, which is a really cheap industrial cleaner from Home Depot. There's that guy. I'm going to hit the next guy here with some blue, and I'm going to hit the others with my light brown and my bone color, and we'll come back when that dries to look at the metal. So we're back after painting the shirts, and while I painted the shirts, I also went ahead and painted the facial hair, their beards, and also their regular hair, because I had a lot of these paints on the palette already. So this is my fur brown, if I want a reddish brown look, and then I have monster brown for my brown hair. I went with blonde hair with my skeleton bone, and these are a lot of colors that ended up on these or on other people. As long as I make sure that I don't use the same color for their shirt or pants as I do for their facial hair, that's fine. Now what we're going to do is we're going to hit on the metal bits, swords, axe heads, and of course on these characters, the biggest part of that is going to be their chainmail. And I've got a couple of different options here. Most miniature paint lines usually have at least three gray metallic colors. They're usually going to have a bright silver, some sort of middle tier steel, and then a darker, usually it's called gunmetal. And again, what these paints are, they're metallic paints. They're essentially just gray paints, light gray, medium gray, and a darker gray with metallic flakes in it. I'm just going to warn you, do not thin metallic paints with water. You can, but you have to be very, very light on the water. I recommend, because those metallic flakes, once they get introduced with the water, they go everywhere. I use this matte fluid medium. This is cheap. I've had this for years. It's lasted me forever. And this is a medium that you can thin your paint down a little bit without introducing the water, which is completely going to mess with your metallic paints. One other thing that I am going to recommend is I'm going to recommend, if you have access to this, the absolute hands down best metallic paint that you can buy, in my opinion, is Vallejo Metal Color. It is meant for airbrushes, but you can paint it on, and if I want to make it a little thicker, I mix it with that medium. I happen to have the silver right here, so it matches with this silver. It is such, you can see almost the difference in the pigment density between these two, if they focus. How fine the pigments are in there versus kind of how gloopy it looks on the top of this. Now I'm going to be going with this plate mail metal. The silver is too bright and I don't have a steel color in this Vallejo. I need to pick one up. But I do, these are fantastic. They are more expensive than these. This is about $10, but it's significantly larger also. This is 32 millimeters, while this is, I want to say 18. So a little less than double. You are paying more for the price, but it's hand down, it's absolutely worth it. So I'm just going to take my paint and go in there and hit the mail. At this point, you want to be careful. You do not want to hit your previous colors with this paint, or metallic colors can be a little hard to go back over, because once those flakes, those metallic flakes that are in the paint are on there, they can really show through unless you put a lot of coats on to cover over them. So at this point, you really want to be careful. In order to be careful, I'm going to turn the camera on, and we'll be back once this metallic color is on everything. So this is the point at which I said earlier in the video, you may have possibly wanted to do parts of the cloak, specifically a part of the cloak that is in between their legs and underneath their torso earlier on. Now I'm going in and I'm just going to be careful. I've got three different cloak colors here. These are all the colors I've used before. The Luftwaffe uniform for my blue, skeleton bone for my beige, and then I'm going actually with I'm using three different reds for reasons that we'll talk about when we get to the shields. I'm using my darkest red, dragon red, and I'm just going to go in and very carefully do the inside of the cloak. This might require a little bit of cleanup, because I did not do this earlier, and you can do this earlier in the process if you don't want to have to come back and do cleanup afterwards. I can already see I got a little on the boot, although it is on the back side of the boot, so I'm going to have to decide if I want to do some cleanup, and there's a lot more on the boot. All right. The other areas we're going to have to watch out, on the back it's fine. You can just slop that on, just avoid the hair, but the areas of the cloak around the male sleeves and kind of dangling underneath the arm, and then of course next to the rest of the body, you just have to be careful. Also, depending on your figure, this guy has it's a little hard to tell what's the cloak and what's his sheath, so you just have to keep an eye out for that, and at some point you might just have to make a judgment call. So I'm going to hit this guy, finish him up in red, and then hit the others in blue and skeleton bone. And this is the area where if I was batch painting large numbers of these, I would do all the red cloaks, all the blue cloaks, all the green cloaks, etc. give myself like 4 or 5 different cloak colors so I could really mix it up. We'll come back when this is done, and we'll talk about the wood, which is pretty much it for the figures, and then we'll come back and do the shields. So there's one last step I forgot before we start applying the shields, and that is we need to hit all of the leather bits, usually the shoes and the belts, and occasionally something else, with a brown color. So I've chosen the aptly named leather brown. Not necessarily because of the name, but just because I like the color. And I'm going to go back in, and again, I'm just going to hit these boots. And it's a little hard to tell on the sculpt of this figure, but he has, and most of them do, have a leather belt going across the center of their mail, and then some sort of sheath of maybe a knife or something. It's a little hard to tell on some of these sculpts what exactly all this stuff is. This figure, his arm is hiding a lot of his belt, but you can see there's actually a little bit of belt hanging down there. And then if I rotate him, there's a little bit of belt that you can see kind of sticking. Actually, that is the sheath. I'm just going to kind of go in and dab a little brown in there because that's going to be his belt. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to hit all these boots, hit all these belts. I'm also going to go in, while I had the red, I went in and I painted all of the fronts of the shields red just because I already had the red out. And then I'm also went in, and before I applied them, I painted all the backs of the shields, just whatever brown wooden color you want to go with. I usually do it a dark color because the shields, the back of the shield is going to be in shadow, so I want to go with the dark wood. After that, then we'll talk about what color do we want to paint our wooden axe and spear halves. At this point, we're almost done with the figures before the washing phase. The only thing that we have left is for the axes and the spear hafts, we need to paint that a wood. Now, the easy way to do this, if you want to do this with one paint, is in order to differentiate the wooden color of the, again, axe handles and spear hafts from, say, the dark leather brown or the lighter browns that I may have used for none of these figures, but sometimes some of their clothing. I want to give the wood a bit of a lighter tone. Some Vallejo paints that are good for this are Old Wood or Deck Tan. They're a bit of a lighter tannish brown color, but I don't have those colors. So what I've done is I've come up with my own mix. You could do your own just to make it different. I mix a little bit of Monster Brown and Skeleton Bone to make it a bit of a light tanny brown, and then I throw a little bit of this wood color I happen to have in, which gives it a hint of something different, something just a hint of orange. You end up with this very desaturated brown color with just a hint of kind of red in it, and you can mix this to your own taste. One of the good things about this too is because I'm doing these Vikings, these aren't Space Marines with matchy armor. These are Vikings with wooden spear hafts that were all made from different trees. And so I would expect the wood to look a little different. Now, if it looks a little light now, it is going to get darkened down when we apply the wash. That's one of the reasons why I chose this color. I want it to be a little light, and there I have to clean up that cloak now, but that happens. So anyway, I want this to be a little light so that the wash can darken it down. And it really differentiates it from the other brown colors that I have on the model. But because every time I mix this up, the ratios are ever so slightly different, all of my spears are going to look just a little different every time I paint them. And I like that they're not all matchy. Of course, this makes my life a little more difficult, but for the 1 minute it takes me to mix up a batch of this every time I paint spear hafts or axe handles, it's not a big deal. Once I'm done painting this on, I am now done painting all of the figures, pre-wash stage at least. I will go back over them to double check for things that need to be cleaned up, like how I just got brown on my cloak there. And then I'm also going to glue the shields in place. These figures have little pegs. And one other thing, for figures with sheaths, these sheaths I'm going to be painting as, you could paint them, I'm not 100% sure what sheaths are always made of. I think it depends on the time period and the nation. With these Vikings, I've been just kind of going with the same wood color. You could also paint them with one of the browns that you use for leather. Maybe they're leather wrap sheaths. I'm not really super concerned about it, but I am going to hit the sheaths as well. And then we'll come back to apply our wash. And our almost last step before highlights is a good old-fashioned wash. As with my Viking Berserkers, I'm using a combination of Army Painter Soft Tone with a little bit of their wash mixing medium in it. You can use water, although it affects the surface tension properties of the wash, so I would recommend the mixing medium. And I use this in a roughly 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. It's not exact. And I want to give these Vikings a nice warm look to them. It's just an aesthetic choice I chose for them. I could go in, especially on the male, and use a dark wash, but I find for 15mm figures, it can be very difficult to make sure that you get the wash in the right spot. Whereas on a 28mm figure, you could put a wash in different areas. On a 15mm, it's kind of tedious. And then when I'm banging out figures like this, I don't really want to have to do that. Maybe if it's a special character, like some sort of leader character, I might do that. But for these figures, not really something I'm going to have to do. So I'm going to wash these all. I'm going to leave them to dry at least a half hour, preferably an hour, although I'm going to leave these overnight so I know it's going to be dry. And then we're going to come back and hit them with some choice highlights to really take it up one final step before we call it and say that they are done. Now that we let the wash dry, we're going to apply some highlights. Now I'm going to make a separate video on how to do highlights on cloth and also on the metal when I do some of my unarmored Vikings, because you can't really highlight the chainmail, and the weapons and the helmets are pretty straightforward, so I'll do that in another video. In this video, we're just going to focus on highlighting the shields. How do you highlight these shields? And we're going to use a stippling method. So what you're going to do first is you actually want to put this directly under a light. So if there was a light here, I'd want to hold it straight under the light and then take a photo of the shields. Now, in this particular case, these guys' shields are all over the place. If I had thought this through ahead of time, I would have made sure that all their shields are facing the same direction. His is facing right, his is forward, his is backwards, and his is kind of off to the right and back. So you'd want all the shields lined up. You're going to have to make multiple photos. Save that for a second. Then you want to line up three colors. Dragon red is my original red. Pure red is going to be kind of my medium tone, and then I have Vallejo Scarlet. If you don't have three reds, you could just use one red and then mix in. White's going to give you a pinker. Yellow is going to give you more of an orange. I like Scarlet, which is more of an orange, so you could mix in yellow. What we're going to do first is we're going to take our original, and the wash is kind of dulled down this red. Now, you could avoid putting the wash on the shield, but then you're going to miss some of the shadowing around some of the edges. So I'm going to take this red and apply it to my palette. I use a wet palette because it keeps everything wet. Keeps everything moist, so it's not going to dry out. And then you're going to want to glaze over the shield. So I'm applying some water. You want this to be really, really thin. This is not a base coat consistency. It's really more of a water with pigment. Very thin there. And we're going to take this and we're going to go back over the red parts of the shield. Now with this one with the blue cross in it, I'm going to avoid the areas by the cross, and I'm going to avoid the areas by the edges of the shield because I don't want to have to go back and clean that up. And also I kind of want that darker shaded red by those edges to give the illusion of shadows. This is going to bring our red back up to its original hue while still giving us a little bit of the effect of that shade. Once you're done with this, take your photo, using the filters on your camera or photo editing software, set it to black and white, and then take the contrast value and jack it up to maximum. I'm going to show you an example of what this photo looks like now, and then we'll come back and explain why we did that after this dries. So the reason that we took that black and white photo and then we jacked up the contrast is because we want to place highlights on our shields. Now, for most shields, like with most miniatures, like this guy right here, you can typically go with a pretty straightforward highlight system of dark, medium, bright. But sometimes when you look at the light, like with this figure, when I showed you that photo, there was a highlight down here on the bottom. So we actually, because of the way the shield is angled, we actually want the top to be darker because the light is shining more brightly on the edge down here at the bottom. So You don't need to do this, but if you really want to, especially sometimes when you have these shields that instead of being held kind of relatively, not perfectly, but relatively perpendicular to the ground, these shields that are a little more angled, uh, not at like a 45-degree angle, you might actually want to highlight the bottom of the shield. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take, this was our base color. This is going to be our medium color. We're going to put this down to a glaze consistency. This is a pretty thin color. There's a lot of water in this. And what we're going to do is, there's so much water on this brush that if I were just to touch it to the model, there's just a lot of liquid there. We don't want that. So we're going to take a paper towel and we're going to wick some of the liquid off. So you can see there's still paint on here, but not nearly as much. Cannot get this to focus. Not nearly as much as there was. And then we're going to take our shield and we are going to stipple. We're going to do kind of a stabbing motion at the center 1/3 of the shield, up and down, which is going to give us a little bit of texture. You're also going to carry this up to the upper 1/3 of the shield. So we do the middle 1/3 and the upper 1/3 with this stippling. Try to avoid, especially with this shield where we have kind of like this ring around the edge, which I've painted in a hide color. Try to avoid getting in those crevices because you want that shadow preserved. Now, this looks really shiny right now. When it dries, it's going to go a little bit more matte, so it's not going to look as dramatic. Same thing with this guy. We just have to avoid the bottom, and we have to avoid the blue cross symbol. Have to be a little more careful. Now, once this dries, we're going to take our brightest color, and it dries pretty quickly because there's so much water in it. You can see it's already dry. The water evaporates really quickly. We're going to take our brightest color. We're going to do the same thing, but only to the top 1/3. It's subtle, but it's going to give you a good highlight effect. We'll come back, we'll see what it looks like at the end, and I'm also going to show you how to fix this if you go too far and it's a little overly dramatic. And now we're done. So you can see on the shield on this guy right here, there is a gradation from the darker red to the medium red to the lighter red. And it's a subtle effect. I like to go subtle. You can punch it up more even if you want. The thing is, if you punch it up a lot, and I've done this on purpose, you end up with this guy's shield here, where it's just kind of got like this bright orange stripe there up on the top. And that's especially because scarlet paint, it's going to have more white in it. White tends to be opaque, and so it's harder to keep those transitions nice and translucent. So there is a solution to this problem. If you've done this and you said, oh my God, what have I done? How do I fix this? There's a big orange stripe on the top. And then you can see the transition between the dark red and the medium red is a lot more subtle. And the solution is you glaze over it with the dark red again. You take your original dark red or dark whatever color, you put a lot of water in it until you get that glaze effect. And then because we don't want all that paint coming off the brush, we're going to wick some of it off on our paper towel. So there's still some paint on that brush, but not an overwhelming amount. And then we come back and we glaze over it, which is going to bring these 3 different red tones, dark red, medium red, and scarlet, back together and kind of dull that scarlet down so it's not screaming, look at me, I'm an orange shield. It's just a little bit more. And if you, after that, it's still wet, so you're not going to get the full effect. It's very shiny. If you're still not happy with it, you go back over it again. Now, this is a time-consuming process. Shields are tough because they're just a big, flat surface. And big, flat surfaces are hard to highlight because you can't just go in and edge highlight it. There's nothing to edge highlight, and so you have to be careful with this. If you look at this guy's shield where I went in ahead and I highlighted this edge, it's still a little glossy. When you glaze things, they tend to get a little glossy. So when I hit with this matte varnish, it's going to be less shiny, but there is a subtle scarlet edge here on the edge of the shield. I'm also going to go back in and do a similar thing to his gray blue. But this is pretty much how I do my shields. Again, a little time consuming, but I like the effect it gives. And if you're doing a small warband, it's fine. If you're doing hundreds and hundreds of figures, don't do it. If you're doing 6mm, absolutely don't do it. But at 15mm, it can be a nice effect, and I enjoy it. For the rest of the figures, I'm going to highlight those myself. I'm going to come back in a second video where I do the cloth unarmored figures and focus on how do I highlight cloth, because there's not a lot of cloth going on here, and we'll talk about that then. Everyone, you keep hobbying, and I'll talk to you later.